Welcome to the Activation Podcast, brought to you by the Conscious Resistance Network. I'm your host, Derrick Broze, and every episode of this podcast, we're going to explore solutions in the areas of health, permaculture, growing your own food, technology. We'll be interviewing guests who are providing important solutions that are more important than ever in this time we are living in. The Activation Podcast is focused on bringing you cutting-edge solutions to empower humanity. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Activation Podcast. This week, I have a very interesting guest, somebody that I think many of you are becoming familiar with, not only because his work is getting out there. If you don't know his name, I'm sure you've heard the phrase mass formation by this point, but also his book has now been making the rounds, getting out there in front of many people in the independent, alternative, and maybe even eventually some of the mainstream media as we question not just the response and the reaction to COVID-19 that we've seen in the last 2 years, but really the psychology behind that, the psychology behind totalitarianism. And specifically, I think what many of us have started to refer to as COVID-1984 in a perhaps half-joking manner. So I'm excited to talk to my guest today, Professor Mattias Desmet, who is, I believe, let me make sure I say this correctly, Professor of Clinical Psychology in the Department of Psychology and Educational Sciences at Ghent University. And I'm just excited to bring you on board. So thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, I mean, I've seen your work getting out there in the last 6 months to a year. Many people first probably became familiar with it through Joe Rogan's podcast, Dr. Robert Malone, who this audience is familiar with, mentioning it and sort of describing it in his own terms. And now I think we're at the point where, you've been able to put this into book form. As I said, the book is called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. We're going to talk about that today. But before we go any further, could you just maybe give a little bit of your background and then some background on your work in mass formation?
Yeah, sure. As you said, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a professor in clinical psychology at Ghent University. And I started working at university about 19 years ago. Yes, about 19 years ago. And I was supposed, when I started to work as a researcher at Ghent University, I was supposed to do a classical psychological research in which I would investigate the connection between, or the associations between, all kinds of personality styles and the symptoms of depression. And as soon as I started with that research, I noticed that the research methods, in my opinion, were far from sound, and in one way or another that they lacked validity. And that was the moment when I decided to switch the topic of my PhD, or the focus of my PhD. And rather than doing this classical research, I started to investigate the research methods themselves. And during these years, I also got an additional master degree in statistics, just because I wanted to understand the mathematical basis of the research methods as well as possible. And when I was about 2 years investigating the quality of the research methods, the so-called replication crisis started in the sciences. And it was this crisis that showed that up to 85% of the papers, of the published research findings in academic research, are false, that there is something wrong with them, that they are not valid, that, for instance, that they cannot be reproduced. I won't go into detail about what exactly reproducibility means, but it just means if research findings cannot be reproduced, it means as much as that they are without scientific credibility and without scientific validity. And as soon as I finished my PhD, I wrote a small book in which I explained and showed in an as accessible and an as tangible, as concrete way as possible why the research methods, for instance, the measurement methods in psychology and also in other academic domains, lacked all validity. And the examples that I gave in the mathematical simulations that I did were so clear. They were so it was so obvious. The way I showed it was so obvious that I could not imagine that my colleagues wouldn't see what I meant. But to the contrary, when I tried to show them what the problems with their methods were, they became angry at me, or most became angry at me. And that was the moment where I started to become interested in mass psychology, just because I had the impression that the only thing that could explain how and why people can become so radically blind and so radically incapable to take a critical distance of what they believe in. The only explanation for that strange blindness, in my opinion, or the most important explanation for that strange blindness, has to be situated not at the level of individual psychology, but at the level of group psychology, at the level of, and more specific, at the level of the psychology of the crowds, of the masses, which is a specific, one specific kind of group. And then, as soon as the Corona crisis started, it was as if I went through this process in a fast way. I looked at the research findings, at all the statistics, the corona-related statistics, at all the mathematical models that were used, and I immediately had the impression that they were wrong, or at least that they dramatically overrated the dangerousness of the virus. And first, I tried to show people what I believed was wrong with the statistics, and I had exactly the same experience as the one I had 15 years before at university, and exactly the same experience, namely that people didn't want to see it, that they became angry. And that was when I decided to switch my focus and to focus on not so much on the statistics and the problems, the flaws in statistics, but rather on the psychological processes that were going on in society, and it could explain why people continue to buy into a narrative which used such absurd mathematical models and statistics. And so that was how I entered this crisis, let's say.
Before we dive deeper into your book and the work on mass formation, I'd like to just probe a little further on the reproducibility, because as you talk about in your book, you know, there's almost an ideology behind what we're seeing here, behind that failure or the desire not to want to look at the information that you were just describing, right? Whether that's about COVID-19 or other issues that people perhaps with experience, with credentials, with degrees, and with expertise in some areas, just for whatever reason don't want to question their own work. And I think that it's that sort of awareness in the mainstream that increasingly people don't trust science, right? Like, for right or wrong, people have questions about the science Inc., as some might put it, right? Not necessarily the scientific method, but the science that they see being put in front of them, the papers, the research, and the way that research is used to justify certain things, like obviously in the case of COVID-19. But do you think that this problem, clearly I think the answer is yes, that this problem predates COVID-19, right? As far as science being put out there, research being put out that really can't be reproduced, and as you said, might not be valid and might not even represent scientific facts. Why do you think that there is this tendency to not want to, like when you provided your research, and as you said, some people didn't want to hear it, they turn away, or they just shout you down, or just aren't interested? Why do you think that exists within these various fields?
Yes, well, the problem with academic research has many causes and many origins. It's a complex matter, I think. But, well, in general, we could say that on the one hand, we have this mass psychological explanation, which explains why people become blind, why people continue to buy into a narrative, even if it is utterly absurd or blatantly wrong. So the mass psychological explanation is one thing. You can look at it from different angles, I think. For instance, also, like, it has a lot to do, I believe, with what we call science now is rather a scientific ideology. It's rather a scientistic ideology, to be more correct. Science, when modern science emerged in our culture, let's say somewhere around in the beginning of the 16th century, science was a discourse through which a minority went against a dominant discourse, which at that time was like an institutionalized, dogmatic, religious discourse. And at that moment, as long as science was the discourse of a minority, through which a minority went against a dominant discourse, at that moment, science was very fruitful. Science was like an open-minded position in which people try to put aside all dogmas and all prejudices and try to look at the world in an open-minded way. And this new discourse, this scientific discourse, was so successful, that it soon became the dominant discourse. And then, at that moment, something very specific happens. At the moment, a discourse of a minority, a fruitful, open-minded discourse of a minority, which is a kind of truth speech in the beginning, a truthful speech, a sincere and honest discourse. At the moment such a discourse becomes a dominant discourse, it usually gets perverted. It progressively loses its characteristics as truth speech. And the reason why that happens, I never understood this. I really understood this. I knew that this process happens time and time again throughout history, but I couldn't really pinpoint why it happened. And throughout the writing of my book, I suddenly started to understand that the explanation was probably very simple. When a discourse of a minority becomes the discourse of the majority, then it becomes the privileged instrument to have an impact on the majority of the people. So it becomes the privileged instrument to manipulate, cheat, lie, to have a grip on society, on the population, on the majority of the people. And that's exactly what happened with science. Science, the more successful scientific discourse became, the more it was used for purposes that actually it was not meant to be used for. For instance, in advertisement, people used scientific discourse to be successful in society, and so on. You can list an endless number of things. And that's the reason why, of course, a discourse that becomes dominant, usually because it becomes an instrument of power and of manipulation. And in this way, it loses its characteristics of truth speech. And that was what happened with science as well. And that's the reason why, of course, somewhere in the beginning of the 21st century, let's say around 2004, 2005, it suddenly became clear that most academic research actually didn't have a lot to do with science. And that problem exists until, for instance, in the medical sciences, up to 85% of the published research findings cannot be reproduced. John Ioannidis wrote this wonderful paper titled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." I think it was published in 2005. Could be a little bit later, I don't know it exactly anymore. But that's, of course, a huge problem. It's a huge problem if, for a society which situates all authority in science and in academic research, our society believes that academic research is the cornerstone should be the cornerstone of human living together. That's what we have seen in the Corona crisis, and we see at the same time that this academic research actually fails. That became so clear during the Corona crisis. It became clear to the general public during the Corona crisis, or to everyone who wanted to see it. all this academic research that proved that the vaccine would be efficacious, that all these mathematical models that were built to predict what the course of the pandemic would be. We all remember how the mathematical models of Imperial College in the beginning of the crisis predicted that in a small country such as Sweden, about 60 to 80,000 people would die if the country didn't go into lockdown, and the country didn't go into lockdown, and only 6,000 people die. And to arrive at that figure, the victims claimed by the virus had to be counted even in a very, what I call, enthusiastic way. So it would have been much less people if they would have been counted in a normal way. So that shows so clear that these mathematical models were absurd. And that's the problem we are facing, I think, in our society.
Yes, and I think that it's, that sort of prefacing that leading up to COVID-19 and then what we're focused on today with mass formation is important, because there are people who might have just spent the last couple of years starting to question these sort of things and might have thought, well, prior to COVID, science was great. Everything was, academic research was top notch. There's nothing to question. Obviously, we're not here to say all academic research is, or that every academic out there is, is full of it or anything like that. But clearly there are quite a bit of papers and, research out there that can't be reproduced, as you said, and doesn't perhaps really qualify as science. So I think that is important, because it feels like to me, without whether that started in 2004, 2005, or even prior, whenever it started, or maybe it was a progressive march towards where we are now, that you kind of need that in place in order to get to the point where we are now. Which brings me to your book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, where I've just been reading it the last week or two, and I really just want to say I really appreciate the effort you put into this. I think it's extremely valuable, and I highly encourage everybody who has a chance to pick up a copy of the book. I just wanted to, maybe we could dive into a few areas. There's a couple of really good points. I mean, there's many good points in here, but there's a few sections for today's conversation perhaps we could focus on. And some of it we've already been dipping into. Science and ideology, I think we've started to kind of talk about that. But maybe now, since we've set the stage a little bit, we could get a more concrete definition for how you term mass formation. Because I do know in the beginning, when this work was going viral out there, there was people were saying mass formation psychosis. And as from what I've heard you say in other interviews, I believe, you prefer to just mass formation. Could you tell us just a more specific definition of that, and perhaps how your work either builds upon or maybe even, differs from some of the work we've seen over previous decades, the work on crowd psychology and things of this sort?
Yes. Well, mass formation just refers literally to the formation of a mass which is a specific kind of group. So mass formation is a specific kind of group formation, a group formation which has a very remarkable impact at the level of the psychological and the mental functioning of individuals, of the individuals who are in the grip of this kind of group formation. For instance, individuals who are in the grip of mass formation typically tend to become radically incapable to take a critical distance of what they believe in, and this goes quite far. For instance, in 1979, during the Iran Revolution, the revolution in Iran, there was this, which was like a large-scale process of mass formation in Iran. People started to believe that the portrait, the photo of the Ayatollah, whom they considered to be their leader, the leader of the mass, was printed on the surface of the moon. And when there was a full moon at the sky, people typically stood in the streets, pointing at the moon, showing each other where they could see the portrait of the Ayatollah on the surface of the moon. So that's one example of how the strange blindness that can emerge in individuals who are in the grip of a process of mass formation. So the people in the mass formation can really start to believe the most absurd and the most strange ideas or thoughts. And a second very important characteristic is that individuals who are in the grip of mass formation typically become willing to radically sacrifice everything that was important to them before the mass formation started. So it is as if people in the mass formation lose every awareness of their own individual egoistic interests to a very extreme extent. A third characteristic is that people who are in the grip of mass formation typically become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. They become intolerant for everyone who speaks out against what the masses believe in. This can go quite far. In the end, masses typically start to destroy. First, they start to stigmatize. They very often give signs to the people who don't want to go along with them. And in the end, they tend to destroy or to commit cruelties towards the people who do not go along with them. And what is even more characteristic, they do so as if it is their ethical duty to do so. And they do so also, they commit these cruelties also towards the people whom they used to love very much before the mass formation started. To give you only one example, I will refer to the revolution in Iran in 1978, 1979. Again, I talked with this woman who lived in Iran during the revolution. Her name is Shoref Eshtari. You can, the conversation I'm talking about is still available on the internet. Well, this woman described me how she had seen with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state, how she hung the rope around his neck when her son was on the scaffold. And when he was hung, she claimed to be a heroine for what she did. That's the typical end stage of a process of mass formation. And that shows how extremely important it is to understand the mechanism of mass formation. Because if you understand it, you can avoid that the process goes to the last stage where the masses typically start to commit cruelties. So how does it work, this process of mass formation? A mass formation is a kind of group formation, a specific group dynamic that emerges under very specific conditions. And the first and most crucial of these conditions is that many people in a society have to feel disconnected. They have to feel disconnected from their natural and their social environment. And that was definitely the case in the Corona crisis. Just before the crisis started, or in the years before the crisis started, the number of lonely people peaked. Worldwide, there were over 30% of the people who reported not to have one meaningful relationship. And that's also very interesting. This number of people was clearly correlated to the level of industrialization and the level of technology use in a country. The higher the level of industrialization, the more technology use, the more people feel disconnected and lonely. For instance, in the United Kingdom, Theresa May appointed a minister of loneliness because she acknowledged how many people felt lonely in her country. And in the United States, the US Surgeon General reported that there was a loneliness epidemic in the States. So that shows this loneliness of disconnectedness was very present in society just before the Corona crisis started. And then from there on, as soon as many people feel lonely and disconnected, it's like a cascade of effects, of psychological effects, that leads to the mass formation. So once people feel disconnected and lonely, they typically will start to experience a lack of meaning making in life. Lack of meaning making, which was also very clear. Over 60% of the people worldwide before the corona crisis, reported that they considered their job to be a so-called bullshit job, which means a job which they didn't know of what the meaning or the purpose of it was. And after that, once people feel disconnected and feel confronted with experiences of lack of meaning making, a very typical effect will happen at the level of their affective emotional functioning. Namely, they will be confronted with so-called freely floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. All their negative feelings will disconnect from mental representations, and people will start to feel anxious, frustrated, aggressive, without knowing what they feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for. And this is a very aversive mental state. When you feel anxious and you don't know what you feel anxious for, you feel completely out of control. And when you feel frustration and aggression and you don't know what you feel frustrated and aggressive for, you cannot direct your aggression at something outside of you. And it is as if all the aggression and frustration heaps up in yourself, it remains in yourself, and the level of tension in the end becomes unbearable. And when people are in this condition, something very typical might happen. If under these conditions, a narrative is disseminated through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety, and at the same time providing a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, for instance, the lockdowns to deal with a virus, or QR codes to deal with people who are not vaccinated, and so on. So when such a narrative is distributed, all this free-floating anxiety might suddenly connect to the object of anxiety, and there might be a huge willingness to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, even if the strategy, in many respects, is absurd and self-destructive. Just because, by participating in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, people realize, like a first important psychological advantage, they can connect their anxiety now to one object, and they can control that object mentally by participating in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. And at the same time, they also have an object to direct all their frustration and aggression on. And that's the first step. And then in a second step, which is even more important, I think.
Could I pause you for a second before we go to the second step? So there was something you mentioned, and I want to go see if we can dive a little deeper on that. You mentioned that the prevalence of the feelings of loneliness and lack of meaning making seem to be highest among industrialized societies. Do you have any insights or thoughts on why that is? You mentioned like technology. I mean, there are some critiques, for example, of modern industrialized society, civilization in general, those who believe that this sort of thing that you're describing, lack of meaning making, is itself a product of the type of society we live in, and the ways that technology, for all of its benefits, also has created a sense of disconnect from each other. Could you speak to that, or any thoughts you have on why that prevalence is higher in these industrialized societies?
Hold that thought. Hey guys, this is Derrick Broze with the Activation Podcast, and I want to tell you about a new project that I recently launched. It's called the Holistic Self-Assessment Online Course, and it's based on my 2018 book, The Holistic Self-Assessment. Now, some of you guys know that I released this book based off my experiences in prison. This is essentially the culmination of the process I took myself through while I was locked up behind bars, when I began meditating, when I began journaling, and really starting to heal my trauma and begin to align my thoughts, my words, my actions, and really live in line with my true purpose. So this book is meant to be a self-empowerment, self-help guide that helps you align your thoughts, words, and actions, your relationships, your habits, and make sure you are living in line with your goals and your principles. So I developed this 9-week course with the University of Reason, aka Autonomy. We put this course together for people like yourself to take it and walk through it chapter by chapter. I read the book with you. I give you tips and exercises. And there's actually two options. If you want to just do the DIY version, you can choose to work through the course yourself. If you'd like to pay a little bit of extra money, you can go ahead and get one-on-one sessions with myself where I will counsel you and work through the book with you and answer any questions you have. So I really want to encourage you guys to check this out. The link will be in the description below where you are listening or watching, and I'll put the link to the Holistic Self-Assessment book as well, which you can download for free. And I want you to stay tuned because we're getting ready to release the Holistic Self-Assessment audiobook, the Spanish version of the book, and an upcoming Holistic Self-Assessment 9-day challenge. So stay tuned, guys. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Yes, the first 5 chapters of my book are all about that, actually, about explaining why exactly the mechanization, the industrialization of the world, the use of technology, the excessive use of technology and the excessive industrialization and mechanization of the world leads to this disconnected state and to all the other effects as well. So, of course, well, even simple mechanic devices have the tendency to disconnect us from our natural environment, for instance. If you the use of a watch, before there were watches, wristwatches, for instance, people constantly connected to natural cycles, to the moon, the sun, dew that was drying or not, and so on, in order to be able to orientate in time, and in order to be able to make appointments, for instance. They only had these natural cycles to make appointments. And as soon as there was a watch, well, in a certain way, watches made our lives much easier, but at the same time, they also disconnected us from our environment. And you could think this is only a detail, but it's not true. At the level of mental, psychological functioning, if you would just project the stream of consciousness, the stream of images, thoughts, ideas that constantly goes through the window of our mind, if you would be able to project that stream of consciousness on a screen, you would see that it changed substantially just because of the introduction of watches. And the same is true for the introduction of the steam engine, the use of the introduction of television, radio and television, and even much more, of course, the introduction of mobile phones, cell phones, the introduction of a global GPS, of a navigation systems in our cars. They all have this tendency to disconnect us from the environment. That's the strange thing. We believe, for instance, that technology, for instance, online meetings and online conversations, devices to talk online, to digitally connect with each other. We all believe that they connect us to each other, and in a certain way, that's true, of course. These devices allow us to exchange information in a very effective way. But at the same time, they also take something away of human interaction. I've been doing research for 15 years now in which I investigate in an extremely detailed way the way in which conversations between two people. So I investigate in a very detailed way how conversations between people, real-time conversations, in-person conversations. I focus usually on the conversations between patients and therapists. And to investigate these conversations, we transcribe them in an extremely detailed way. The transcription of one sentence often covers a full page, and it takes often more than 1 day to transcribe one sentence. And when you transcribe a conversation in this way, you see all kinds of things start to surface that you would never see if you didn't transcribe them in such a detailed way. For instance, if two people are talking with each other in the real world, they will typically react to each other in less than 0.2 seconds. Less than 0.2 seconds. That's 5 times faster than our reaction time in traffic, for instance. And this incredibly fast reaction time even manifests. So, for instance, if one person stops speaking, the other will typically start speaking in less than 0.2 seconds. And this happens even when the first person stops speaking in the middle of a sentence. So it shows that this incredibly fast reaction time has nothing to do with a kind of a rational anticipation on the basis of the syntax structure of the sentences that the first speaker produces. No, it's something else that allows us to react in this incredibly fast time. It's the fact that when we are talking with each other in the real world, we constantly physically resonate with each other. Literally, our bodies constantly internally imitate each other. When one person listens to someone else who is speaking, the muscles on his face will, the tension in the muscles of his face will imitate the tension in the face muscles of the person he is listening to. That's only to give only one example. Also at the level of the neurological functioning, we will see this internal imitation. But it's exactly this physical resonance that allows us to gauge in an almost perfect way the mental processes of the person we are listening to. So there's this constant symbiosis, a symbiosis which is at the same time a physical and a psychological symbiosis. Two people who talk with each other in the real world merge with each other. It is as if they form an overarching supra-system. And it's this incredible resonance, physical and psychological resonance, that doesn't manifest, or that manifests only in a very limited way when people talk digitally. Because just when you talk digitally with each other, there is also always this small delay at the level of the transmission of the signal. And there are also many other things that make that a digital conversation is not the same as a real conversation. You can only take one perspective on the people you're talking to, for instance. You see only a limited part of the body of the other, and so on. They could continue forever. So, but this is typically what happens. So, while we think that technology connects us to each other, it actually destroys something of the most profound and most essential human characteristics of human interaction. And that's all all things like this that explain why the higher the level of mechanization, the higher the level of industrialization, the higher the level of technology use, the more people feel disconnected without them knowing why they feel disconnected. And that's so. As soon as people are in this disconnected state, they will typically start to be confronted with lack of meaning making, start to be confronted with free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression, and then they will start to become vulnerable for these narratives that indicate an object of anxiety and provide a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. And then, for instance, in the case of when such a mechanism leads to a large-scale process of mass formation, as happened during the Corona crisis, I believe that the Corona crisis was the first worldwide real phenomenon of mass formation. We've seen something similar with the war on terror. We've seen something similar with in other occasions as well. But it was the first time. The Corona crisis was the first real, fully fledged phenomenon of mass formation. I could explain that, but I won't go into detail. But it's clear that it was the first fully fledged phenomenon of mass formation, and that exactly that in the at first sight, it seems that this mass formation reconnects people to each other. So it seems as if this emerging mass ends is a solution for the loneliness people felt. But the point is that it is not. That's so important, because a mass or a crowd is a group that forms not because individuals connect to each other, but because each individual separately connects to a collective. This typical solidarity, this typically new citizenship, this feeling of solidarity, feeling of new citizenship, which is so characteristic for an emerging mass, is not a solidarity of one individual to another individual. It's a solidarity of one individual, of each individual separately, with the collective ideal. And the longer a mass formation exists, the more it sucks away all the psychological energy, all the love, you could say, from the bonds between individuals, and it invests it all in the bond between the individual and the collective. And that's the reason, of course, why during the Corona crisis, so many people were all talking about solidarity, and at the same time, they accepted that when someone got an accident on the street, their governments told them that they were no longer allowed to help that person. It was stipulated like that at the websites of Belgian, Dutch, European governments, and I think also at the websites of the USA government. And that's also the reason. So in the end, when a mass formation lasts for a long time, the bonds between individuals become weaker and weaker and weaker. They impoverish progressively, and the bond between the individual and the collective becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. And in this way, in the end, you arrive in a radically paranoid atmosphere where every individual is willing to snitch other individuals or report them to the state when they believe that this other individual is not loyal enough to the collective or to the state. So that explains why every totalitarian state, which is always based on mass formation, in the end ends up in a radically paranoid atmosphere.
So, I mean, just a couple of things. You said a lot of really important things there. First off, you mentioned GPS when it comes to technology. This is something that myself, I'm not a Luddite. I love technology. I enjoy technology, but I don't have a cell phone. I've resisted cell phones for a long time. I've had them for years and found the convenience and the wonderful, aspects of it. But also I felt some of the things you're talking about. Little things that, like, for example, growing up prior to the internet, I was born in 1984. So I do remember life before the internet and all the technology. I used to carry around a list of phone numbers of all my friends and family that I kept with me, and little things that I remember that I used to be able to recall any number, hundreds of numbers just out of my head because I would write them down, because I would have to type them out. Now you put it in the phone, you never type it again. Once you put it in the phone, you never have to think about it again. And that, I think, is just little subtle things that I see. I'm like, wow, my brain can handle, remembering numbers in this just mass scale. But because I'm not doing it, I've sort of lost that ability. And then the other thing, when it comes to GPS, again, like, I know so many people, especially in the younger generations, who probably couldn't even find their way to their own house without, Google Maps, because they've kind of outsourced that task to the technology. And yeah, when it's there and it's convenient, it's great and it's nice. But to me, it gets into like bigger discussions around how people are handing their lives and their sovereignty and their individual choices over to the technology as well, right? Because, people don't really think, well, why is the Google Maps telling me to take this turn instead of that turn? And I think we're headed towards a future where those decisions being made by AI and algorithms could really be detrimental in ways that we're not even ready to conceive just yet. So I think that's a really important point for people to remember. And then the other thing that I was taking away from some of the last things you were saying there is that, and I'd love your take on this. I mean, is this at the heart of it? Is this ultimately a battle between collectivism and individuality, like individualism, like, however you want to term that? Because it does seem like that's what totalitarianism works around, is, the mass, but the belief that whatever, their aim is, hey, we have to solve COVID at all costs, lockdowns, anybody who's against it is the enemy, shun them, question them, fire them, whatever. Is that what it comes down to? I mean, are these the two ideologies that are really battling each other here?
Yes. Mass formation is always extreme collectivism. So, in my understanding, what a human being needs is like a balance between individualism and collectivism. And some prefer the balance to be a little bit more in the direction of the individualism. Some prefer the balance to be a little bit more in the direction of collectivism. But usually there should be a balance between the two. And in a mass, all individualism disappears. The masses do not permit any individuality deviating from the group norm. That was That's a quote from Canetti. And so that's the point. In a mass, it is as if the individual disappears and is replaced completely by a group identity, by a mass identity. And that's, of course, something very dangerous. And that holds true for totalitarianism as well, because totalitarianism, a totalitarian state, is a state system which is based on mass formation. People often confuse a totalitarian state with a classical dictatorship, but it's not the same at all. It's even to the contrary. It's even the opposite in many respects. A classical dictatorship is always based on the fact that people are scared of a small group, a dictatorial regime, and because they are so scared, they allow this small group to impose its social contract unilaterally. That's in a nutshell what a classical dictatorship is. A totalitarian state is based on a much more impressive and much more complex psychological procedure, namely mass formation. In the totalitarian state, there is first this typical group formation in the population, through which a certain part of the population, usually about 20 to 30%, becomes fanatically in the grip of a certain narrative and of a certain ideology. And once this mass formation emerged, and we've explained the mechanisms a few minutes ago, once this mass formation emerged, there is usually this set of leaders who take advantage of it and who use it, and sometimes the leaders provoke it artificially. That's also a possibility. That happened in the Soviet Union. In Nazi Germany, it went the other way around. There the mass formation was first, and the elite emerged from the masses. But no matter what, whether we are talking about the elite being first or the masses being first, it doesn't matter. In the end, it's a kind of a diabolic pact. And I use a concept of Hannah Arendt now. It's a diabolic pact between the elite and the masses that leads to totalitarianism. So once this fanatic belief in a certain ideology emerges in a certain part of the population, and certain leaders can use it to seize control of the state, we see the emergence of a totalitarian state. And this totalitarian state has a much more suffocating impact on the population, because it does not only control public space and political space as a classical dictatorship does, it also controls private space, because it has this huge secret police at its disposal, which is exactly this segment, this part of the population that fanatically believes in a state narrative. And which is prepared to report everyone to the state, even their brothers, sisters, mother, father, doesn't matter, sons or daughters, who don't go along with the narrative. So, and in this way, indeed, totalitarianism is extreme collectivism. It is extreme collectivism. It's a kind of collectivism in which the individual disappears completely in the collective identity and in the collective ideals. Yes.
So I want to get to one of the last sections on your book, and thank you for that explanation. You talked about this. You mentioned this earlier, that really what it seems like is driving this is what you refer to as the mechanistic worldview. You kind of, I can't remember the term you used, but many and I would say in these circles will sometimes refer to this as scientism, not necessarily a scientific method, but something that almost becomes fanatical, nearly religious support of, well, trust the science, these sort of things, and trust the experts, that people shouldn't question things that are handed down from people, with letters next to their name and degrees on their wall or wearing lab coats, this sort of thing. But you also point at something deeper, and this is, we were talking about the lack of meaning making earlier, and I want to move, if we can, as we wrap up here, to whatever, a solution, because I know that you seem to, from my perspective, have some sense of hope that there is a way around this, that not all is lost, and that maybe there is a way to help give some meaning to people's lives and to get past this mechanistic worldview. Could you speak a little bit to that, as far as, what is the solution when people are hearing this? I'm sure every single person that's going to hear this conversation or that has heard your work has friends and family that they might consider to be in that 30% that you were describing, that 20 to 30% people who have bought into this, wholeheartedly. How can we help those people to move beyond this mechanistic worldview and to find some meaning in their lives so that they can break free of these narratives and this sort of, this diabolical pact, as you mentioned?
Yes. Well, the first and most important thing in my analysis is that we have to continue to speak out. Mass formation is a kind of a hypnosis. It's identical. The mechanism is the same. And as such, it is always provoked by the voice of someone, the voice of a leader, the voice of the one who articulates the narrative that leads to the mass formation in public space. And this hypnosis, this hypnotic state, will typically arrive in the deepest stage, the stage where people start to commit cruelties, if there is no dissonant voice anymore. So as soon as you understand that the mass formation is provoked by the voice of someone, you also understand that mass formation is disturbed by a dissonant voice. And it's when this dissonant voice stops to speak out that the end stage, the stage of destruction and cruelties, start. Historical examples show that very clearly. In 1930, the resistance stopped to speak out in the Soviet Union. In 1935, the same happened in Nazi Germany. And in both countries, within a period of 6 months, the destruction campaign started. And so that shows how crucially important it is that the people who are not in the grip of the mass formation, or just that everyone continues to articulate his own opinion in the most sincere and honest way as possible, and not trying to convince the other people, because that doesn't work. Mass formation is extremely strong, and Gustave Le Bon described that already in the 19th century. He said people who are not in the grip of mass formation will typically try to wake up the people who are in it and try to show them how absurd the narratives are they believe in, but that won't work. But that doesn't mean, he said, that the speech of these people doesn't have an effect. It has an effect, an extremely important effect. It will disturb the mass formation, and it will prevent, that's what was perfectly described by Gustave Le Bon, it will prevent the people who are in the mass formation to become deeper and deeper, and it will prevent the masses to start to commit cruelties. So that's one thing. At the same time, speaking out also has other effects. It also has the effect that the people who do not go along with the masses go through a faster process of mental evolution, just because mass formation is dehumanization. And if there are people who do not go along with that dehumanization, they will typically, and if these people try to stick to the principles of humanity, they will typically feel more and more in touch with these principles. And while this happens, they will feel that their own mental strength increases. And so that has been described by people such as Viktor Frankl, by Solzhenitsyn in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, where he talks about his experiences in the concentration camps of Stalin, and where he describes that most prisoners became radically inhumane in the gulags, in the concentration camps, but that there was a small minority of people who evolved in the opposite direction, who tried to represent a little bit of light in this pool of darkness, and who became more and more determined to stick to the principles of humanity. And he describes how these people often became stronger and stronger, not only at the mental, psychological level, but even at the physical level. So there is this typical process. While the mass formation continues, it will exhaust itself. And if the people who do not go along with it make the right choice, which is, in my opinion, an ethical choice, make the choice to stick to the principles of humanity, they will see how the opposite happens in the group of people who doesn't go along with the masses. They will become stronger and stronger. And after a certain time, the descending line of the power of the masses will cross the line of the small group who doesn't go along with the masses, and the small group will be capable of providing new guidelines, new principles to for a new way of living together as human beings. So that's one thing. Speaking out is extremely important, and also at the more cognitive level, we have to try to find a way to move beyond this mechanist view of man in the world. That's clear. It's this mechanist view of man in the world that is so problematic, and that is the root cause of the mass formation and of totalitarianism. And, mechanist view of man in the world is view of man in the world which believes that the entire universe, and man included, is a kind of a machine that can be perfectly rationally described. This view of man in the world, this rationalist view of man in the world, leads directly to a certain isolation. So on the one hand, it leads to industrialization, mechanization, and use of technology, excessive use of technology, and that leads to disconnects people from their environment, natural and social environment. But it also has a more direct effect. When you believe that you can understand the world around you entirely in a rationalist way, when you believe that you can reduce the world around you to the categories of your own logical understanding, then you disconnect yourself already, you isolate yourself already from your environment. Just because if you think logically in a fanatic way, you connect the one logical idea to the other constantly, and you almost literally build a wall around you, which isolates you from your environment. Literally, it is as if, sorry for that. It is as if, it is as if literally you destroy the mystery of life, because you have this dogma or this prejudice that everything can be reduced to your own logical thinking. And I had a very at a certain moment when I was about 25 years old, I started to understand. It was as if it was revealed to me that the world around us, nature, is not rational. And I just became aware of that when I delved deep into the mathematical basis of complex dynamical systems theory, which shows, paradoxically, in a strictly rational way, that all complex dynamical systems in nature, which are most phenomena in nature, are strictly irrational. And it was at that moment that I started to realize that rational thinking can never grasp the mystery and the core and the essence of life. And I think at that moment that it is quite literally as if all the logical building blocks slide away a little bit from each other, as if there are holes appearing in the wall of your logical thinking, and literally as if the eternal music of laws and touch the strings of your own being. That's something that I describe in my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, that man is quite literally a string instrument. He resonates the muscles of his body, but also his soul resonates with the vibration of life around you. And it is at the moment that you can accept and become aware of the limitations of your own rational understanding. It is first at that moment that you can really start to resonate with life around you, and also that you become part of the eternal music of life, and that you start to realize spontaneously that life doesn't end when you die at the physical level. That's so strange. That's something that I am sure that there is a straightforward connection between our ideology of reason, our obsession with rational understanding in our culture, and our incapability of tolerating the idea of dead and dying, which is one of the most serious problems in our society, I think.
Well, I appreciate that answer. And I think that, this is something that we've talked about here on my channel for, a number of years, what I would consider an effort to balance intuition and emotion with logic and with reason, right? Because I think there's value to both, and going maybe too far in one direction and forgetting the other can lead to problems. I'm just about to let you go for the day, and I really do appreciate you sticking with us today. I just wanted to get your opinion on one final thing. I know this isn't your area of expertise, and I definitely don't claim to be an expert on this at all, but in 2020, I wrote 2 articles for The Last American Vagabond, where we've been following your work closely, about something known as parasite stress hypothesis, parasite stress theory. And, the article is titled "Multiple Studies Predicted Governments Become Authoritarian in Response to Pandemics." And so this was written in the middle, the early stages of COVID-19. And I looked at a few different studies, pathogens and politics, further evidence that parasite prevalence predicts authoritarianism. And, the bulk of what the different studies show is a few different things that to me line up with mass formation, that perhaps what they're saying is that when it comes to war, when it comes to famine, when it comes to all sorts of, these large phenomena that affect large populations, that the threat of a parasite or a pathogen, bacteria, virus, etc., has a very unique response in human being psychology. And what the studies show is that power starts concentrating, that they repress dissent, they emphasize submission to authority, social conformity, there's hostility towards outgroups. And it even mentions that even if the perceived threat is not even real, that the response is still the same. So, people may, for example, I think in COVID-19, we definitely know the media and the models you talked about earlier greatly exaggerated the threat of COVID-19. But even with that, there is still this sort of the response that we saw, which I think is the mass formation you're describing. But yeah, do you have anything that you've come across, or just any thoughts on this, like why you think maybe the threat of a pathogen lead itself towards mass formation, and maybe more than other threats?
Yes, because viruses and parasites, all kinds of biological organisms, or small, invisible, hard to control, and exactly because they are so hard to control, they lead to this very strong reaction. They are the perfect objects of anxiety. So I think even only from this perspective, it seems logical to me why they have this psychological effect, why they are so privileged as objects of anxiety. And of course also parasites, viruses, and so on, they perfectly fit our biological reductionist or mechanist, materialist view on man and the world. We are no longer scared from demons or devils or no matter what, just because demons and devils are not concepts anymore in our modern view on man and the world. But the devils and the devils are replaced by all kinds of biological organisms, and so that's another reason why I think they are such privileged objects of anxiety, and why they provoke these very strong societal responses. So that's one thing I could answer to that question.
Well, I appreciate your time today, and I'm gonna encourage everybody who hasn't checked out your book, to go ahead and pick up a copy. Also, I'll include the links to everything else we referenced and some of the different authors you referenced as well. I really do appreciate your time. And I know that you have repeated yourself ad nauseum at this point, and you continue to do interviews sharing this important message. I just want to tell you that, many of us are very grateful to you, not only for the effort and time and energy it takes to put the book together, but also to do these interviews. I know it's exhausting, and we do appreciate it because, as you said, probably the best tool we have right now is to speak out and to keep making sure that this line of questioning and this line of thinking is heard, even if it's not going to be, heard by maybe those who are just following CNN and some of the mainstream. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Well, yes. Well, first and foremost, thank you for inviting me, because I'm always I have a lot on my plate these days, but still, I'm always happy when I'm invited to speak out somewhere, when someone gives me a platform to speak out. And I also want to say thank you to the people who listen to this, because I'm touched very often by how many people made the decision to swim against the tide in these difficult times. And I want to encourage everyone to speak out in his own way, because it's not only it's as important. I'm sure it's as important to speak out in the kitchen, in the shop, in the shopping mall, on the streets, no matter where you can. Even when you speak out to only one individual, it is equally important. When we all speak out in our own way, we will see that this small group of people who doesn't want to conform to this new ideology, this new transhumanist, mechanist, technocratic ideology that is emerging now and seizing control of society, when we speak out together in a quiet way, in a respectful way, living up to the ethical duty, the first and foremost ethical principle, I think, namely the duty to articulate the words that emerge in ourselves and that feel sincere and honest. When we all do this together, you will see that a small group will do something that seems impossible. It will deliver the new principles for human living together, and it will, in the end, be victorious.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Professor Desmet. I appreciate it. And everybody who's been listening, the final thought I have is just, we heard so much today. Please go back and listen and catch all the nuggets in there. But a couple of things just to take home with you as we wrap up. Keep speaking out. Keep speaking out. Keep speaking out. Even when it feels like we're the minority and nobody's paying attention, which I know many of us have felt that in the last 2 years. Keep speaking out, and also continue to find meaning in your lives. For all the benefits that this technology does offer, I think that there's a lot that we can gain by reconnecting to nature, reconnecting to the mysteries of life, as Professor Desmet was saying here. And just make sure to find time with the people you love and the people you care about. And if they happen to be in that 20 to 30% who seem to have bought into the narrative, keep speaking out. Maybe try not to beat them over the head with it, because as we heard here today, it's very difficult to reach people in that phase. But without a doubt, our voices have never been more important. So thank you for being with me today. Thank you, everybody who's been listening. Until next time, this has been the Activation Podcast. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Peace.
Thank you for listening to the Activation Podcast, brought to you by the Conscious Resistance Network. You can find the archives of our show on Spotify, Pinecast, and at theconsciousresistance.com. Thanks for listening.